Okay. So, welcome to Wealth and Wisdom and Wealth, the wealth of the wisdom of Torah, and get rich quick with Jewish tradition. Okay, not exactly how it goes, but hey, we're going to talk about.
That's why we sign up with Donna.
That's right. That's right. This is how you get.
we
quick,
like
right?
the password.
So I want to start. This is a very fascinating and very relevant topic. I'm gonna read a. Just listen to this for a second. The Crystal Restaurant chain, Pier 1 Imports, J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, J.C. Penney, Tuesday Morning, GNC, Brooks Brothers, Lord and Taylor, Steinmart, Century 21. Right? Do you know what all these have in common?
Bankrupt.
Yes, all in 2020. So bankruptcy is a very relevant topic to what's going on in the world right now. And it's an interesting discussion from a legal standpoint. But the idea here is that when things are challenging, we are, there is an instrument known as bankruptcy, various different chapters. We're going to focus on there's chapter 7, there's chapter 11. There are different forms of bankruptcy, but in its purest form, it's the ability for somebody who owes money to be absolved of their debts. And we're obviously going to explore this from a legal standpoint, but we also want to understand what halacha has to say about this. So, and it goes, there's two sides to this coin. There's the person who has loaned the money that has expectations that they're going to get paid back. And there's the person who borrowed the money who may be on hard times and cannot make ends meet and having a hard time breathing through all of it. So what are they to do? So this is what we're going to be analyzing and trying to understand what Torah has to say. In the not too distant past, people who defaulted on their debts were not treated very kindly. In ancient Rome, the law permitted people cutting a debtor to pieces. Right? That's not very fun. And in many places, in many societies, there was the debtor or the children were sold into slavery to pay off the debt. So let's start with a very interesting. We read this in Shul every year, and let's read this case study here. Go ahead. Go ahead, Donna.
Thank you. Now a woman, a wife of one of the disciples of the prophets, cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, has died, and you know that your servant was God-fearing, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves."
Okay, so this is a fascinating story. We read it in Shul. It's a Haftorah. I'm not remembering right now exactly what parsha it is. Regardless, it is the story is of this prophet who, under the wicked queen Jezebel, she harassed the prophets, and there was a prophet Ovadiah who saved many of the prophets by hiding them in caves and bringing them food and drink. In order to provide for them, in order to provide for these prophets, he had to borrow money, and he indeed borrowed so much money that it came a point where he had all these debts, and then to top it all off, he died. So his wife tells the prophet your servant, my husband, has died, and you know that your servant was God-fearing, and the creditor has come to take my children, my 2 children, as slaves. So we see a scenario. So the end of the story is that the prophet performs a miracle, tells her to bring all of her empty vessels, and she begins to pour with this 1 flask of oil, and the oil continues to flow until all of the flasks are full, and then she's able to sell that oil. And there's all kinds of really beautiful spiritual meanings behind the story. But we see here an example straight from the times of the prophets where, that she was at risk of losing her children on account of this. And this was a common practice, and we experienced it throughout Jewish history. I grew up on stories of the Paritz, the local landowner from the old country who had a Jewish family who owed him money, and they were going to throw him into prison, and then they would ransom the family, and there was always these righteous people who came along just at the right time and would make things happen to save the family. But the reality is that this was not uncommon, and in fact, in the year 1824, there was a Londoner by the name of John Dickens, and he was thrown into debtor's prison for an unpaid debt. His family was turned upside down. His 12-year-old son had to work labeling bottles to earn a meager 6 shillings per week. And eventually things improved, and with determination, the young boy achieved his own dreams, which was to become a novelist. And the young boy is Charles Dickens. And now you know the rest of his story. And Charles Dickens, in a really obviously well written, if I may say so myself, passage, shares the following. Sandrine, would you like to read? Don't hear you.
Okay. Take 2. 30 years ago, there stood a few doors short of the Church of St. George in the borough of Southwark, on the left-hand side of the way going southward, the Marshalsea prison. It had stood there many years before, and it remained there some years afterward, but it is gone now, and the world is none the worse without it. It was an oblong pile of barrack building partitioned into squalid houses standing back to back so that there were no back room, environed by a narrow paved yard, hemmed in by high wall, duly spiked at top, itself a closed and confined prison for debtors. It contained within it a much closer and more confined jail for smugglers.
Okay, clearly not a very pleasant place where anybody wants to hang out. Okay, so very clearly the debtor seems to be favored in our modern bankruptcy laws, that they don't have to be subject to all of this mishigas, this harassment and torment and so on. But what about the creditor? Why should the creditor lose out on the loan that he gave in good faith, or he or she gave in good faith to the debtor? So, and of course, we want to see what Torah law and Jewish law have to say on this. Lisa, would you like to read for us?
A diamond merchant declared bankruptcy according to the laws of a country outside Israel. Accordingly, a settlement was made with his creditors to repay a certain percentage of what he had owed. After living in Israel for a number of years, he succeeded in his affairs and was restored to his financial position. Now his previous creditors are demanding that he repay the rest of what they were owed. However, the merchant claims that since they had agreed to accept a certain percentage of the debts as a settlement, he is exempt from any further collections from a standpoint of both law and decency. What is the law?
Okay, so here, thank you for that. So here we are, it's 2020, and we have a modern day situation where somebody has declared bankruptcy, and thus in the country outside of Israel where he received absolution for his debts, then he comes back to Israel and he had borrowed money and now he is restored. and they are claiming that he's got to collect, he's got to pay. Now he's rich, he's got his money back. So what's the law? And again, the question is, what is the law from a Jewish standpoint? Because from a secular standpoint, from a legal standpoint, once the debt is discharged, it's discharged. It's not open anymore. In fact, here's an interesting thing. If you try to pay, a few years back, this was after, I guess it would have been after 2008, it was very common where the credit card companies, if you defaulted on your credit card enough times, they would write off the debt, or they may make a settlement with you. And once they closed the settlement, then if you tried to pay them, they wouldn't take your money. They had nowhere to put it, because there is no debt anymore. Your account's been cleared, and how are they supposed to categorize that as income? It's not debt. It's not. So it's complicated but by secular law, when a debt is discharged, it's discharged. But what about from Jewish law? Does Jewish law even recognize bankruptcy? Is there even a place for such a thing? So according to this scenario, Rabbi Metzger, the chief rabbi of Israel, now we have to analyze the situation. He was given this challenge to analyze the situation, and we're going to do that ourselves here tonight. We're going to look at a number of sources and see what we can come up with. So let's start with a little framework around how to treat the debtors. So the first thing the Torah tells us is, when you lend money to my people, to the poor person who is with you, you shall not behave toward him as a lender. If you take your neighbor's garment as security, you shall return it to him before sunset, for it is his only covering, it is his garment for his skin. In what shall he sleep? And if he cries out to me, I will hear, because I am gracious. So what do we see here? We see very clearly the Torah is telling us that just because someone owes you money, you not only have to be compassionate, but you have to be extra compassionate. If the collateral, the security is his garment, you have to return it to him so he can sleep with it. So what happens to the security? There's not much security if you give the security back. But that's what the Torah tells us. You have to have that compassion for that individual. We also see that according to biblical law, when a creditor demands payment of his debt, if no property belonging to the debtor is found, or only those items that he is permitted to keep are found, the debtor goes free, and we do not imprison him. As it says, you shall not behave toward him as a lender. So a guy doesn't have money, you can't throw him into jail. And finally, one more source sheet here. It is clear that if the debtor does not have money to pay his debts, the creditor cannot force the borrower to work for him, nor sell him on account of the unpaid debt. This is so even if the borrower stipulated that his body will serve as collateral, it is certainly forbidden to torment him until he pays. So we see clearly in these laws that there is a lot of favor on the side of the debtor, that the debtor is protected, you can't abuse him, can't harass him, and so on. Do we find in Jewish law any kind of debt discharge? So there is one possible source, and that is the source of the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. Donna, read for us, please.
At the end of 7 years, you shall make a release. This is the manner of the release: to release the hand of every creditor from what he lent his friend. He shall not exact from his friend or his brother, because the time of the release for God has arrived.
Okay, so this is a very powerful law. When the Shemitah year, every 7th year is a Shemitah year, known as the sabbatical year, where in the land of Israel, we're required to leave the land alone, not to work the land has to rest. And there are a number of other things that take place during that year. One of which is that any debts which were due as the 7th year comes in, and there's a debate whether it's on when the year comes in or when the year leaves, but regardless, any debts that are owed at that point are eliminated. Okay. Now, it happens to be that there's something called a pruzbul. The rabbis instituted a protection for the creditors, but we're not going to get distracted by that. Let's just look at this for a moment as a source, perhaps, for debt discharge. So, can we learn debt discharge from here or not? What do you say?
I have a question, Rabbi.
Sure.
Is on the last line, is that a typo that God has spelled out in full?
Because the time of the release for
The last line, for God has arrived, shouldn't there be, I mean, we usually have the hyphen instead of the O.
Oh no. Well, this is we have the hyphen when we're concerned that someone's going to throw the book out.
Oh,
I guess the JLI doesn't hyphenate because they expect that people are not going to throw these books out.
okay, so it's not absolute. It depends on the circumstance.
Yeah. So do you think that we can use this as a source to support the idea of debt discharge or not?
Yes.
Okay. That's a
If
strong.
if you're in the lucky seventh year.
Okay. So, but you are agreeing that it only happens every 7 years.
Yes.
And it happened whether a person had the ability or didn't have the ability to pay back.
It's like a lottery. Yes, lucky. Yeah.
So it's not really conventional bankruptcy or debt discharge. It's kind of something else.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is not a good source for bankruptcy and debt discharge, primarily for those reasons, because it was not something that somebody could use at another time. And it didn't make a difference whether you could or whether you had the means to pay back the debt or not. It doesn't make a difference. You are exempted from paying it back at the time of the Shemitah. The real reason why this is required during the Shemitah year, like everything, and is specifically connected with the Shemitah year, like everything else with the sabbatical year, is that the whole sabbatical year was intended to be a reminder that God runs the world, that God's in control, that God's in charge. And since amongst those things is that God really is the source of all wealth, not the debts that you have and not the loans that you have, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the debt was discharged at the Shemitah year, nothing to do with a person's means or not. Wait, let's go further. Let's see some other sources and what they may teach us about debt discharge. Sandrine, please read 5a.
When a lender demands payment of a loan, even if the lender is wealthy and the borrower is struggling for his basic subsistence, we are not merciful in judgment. Instead, we expropriate all the movable property that the borrower owns until the last penny of the debt is paid. If the movable property is not sufficient, we expropriate real property.
Okay, and let's read one more here, because this is also very important, and then we'll kind of summarize what we're reading here.
Me still? We tell the debtor, bring all the movable property that you have, don't leave out even a single needle. We give the debtor food for 30 days, clothing for 12 months, not including things like silken clothes or a golden turban, a couch to sit upon, and bed and sheets fit for the debtor to sleep upon. If he is a craftsman, we give him 2 tools of each type. Even a Torah scholar is not spared his book or even a Torah scroll. They are like the rest of his possession that are seized by the creditor.
Okay, so what we have here, these two sources here, teach us something very powerful, that although so far we have not seen a specific instrument for bankruptcy or debt discharge in Jewish law, it's not like we're that nice to the debtor either. We take away all their possessions, except we leave them with their basic means, but we take away all their possessions in order to pay off the debt. In other words, if they are not paying off the debt, we hold them accountable and we take everything they have. We don't leave them their golden turban. We leave them basic clothing. Even a Torah scholar, we take away his books, right? Because these are all owed to the lender, and we have to take that into consideration. And in fact, our tradition tells us in Psalms that the wicked person borrows and does not repay. So somebody who's borrowing and is not repaying, obviously we're not talking about somebody who cannot pay, or who chooses not to pay, somebody who could work and then is not going to work because they have, despite the fact that they have a debt. So the Torah identifies this person as wicked. So we have two sides of the coin here. On the one hand, we have clear responsibility that the debtor has to be invested in paying back, to the extent that we call this person wicked if he doesn't. On the other hand, the creditor has instruction from the Torah not to treat the debtor with harassment. We don't put the debtor in jail, and so on and so forth. So we see two really distinct obligations, which at first glance we don't see a way to let the debtor off the hook, but at the same time we don't have a right to torture and harass them. So I'm going to skip the learning activities in the interest of time, but let's pause for a moment and understand a little bit. Why is it that there is no concept of debt discharge in Jewish law? Why indeed is there no structure for that? So let's play around with this idea for a minute. When my name is Bank of America and I am lending you money, I'm giving you a mortgage on your house. Why should there be a means for you or an other who is not in the position to pay back to be able to declare bankruptcy? What is the logic as it relates to the creditor?
Well, as it relates to the creditor, it would be a way to get something rather than nothing.
Okay, so there's good. What else?
Also, maybe to make a way out at some point of the debtor. You know, like I think about like a house, like at some point, I remember back when the economy was bad, 2000, you know, that you can say, okay, sorry?
I say, when you said when the economy was bad, I was saying, when was that? You meant the other time when it was bad.
Yes, there was a time, 2009, that, you know, we moved from Chicago to Atlanta, and that was not my case, but a lot of my colleagues, we had to move for work. They just give back their house to the bank. And, you know, and that entails that they don't get credit for 4 years and all that. But, you know, at least they didn't go deeper into debt, and, you know, they were able to move, continue with work.
So it's a protection. The way you're describing it is a protection for the debtor. I'm asking the question from the creditor's standpoint. From the creditor's standpoint, why is that fair? So Adana gave one great reason. At least the creditor should get something, right? Yeah. That's, I guess, in some of the chapters where the debt is the assets are protected and certain debts are paid off. But what else? What's another reason why such a thing should be in place? So I'll tell you. Bank of America, and we don't have a problem with Bank of America per se. I'm just picking on Bank of America because that's what comes to mind right now. Bank of America makes a lot of money. They make a lot of money lending money on homes and for businesses, and they collect a lot of interest, and they make a lot of money. And they can choose, in the interest of commerce, right? They take a certain amount of risk to engage in commerce, and knowing that in this process of engaging in commerce and making a lot of profit, they're going to possibly lend money to some deadbeats or people that fall in hard times. And the law protects them in order to ensure that there's a commercial structure where people lend money and people borrow money, they pay interest, they have a way out if things go really sour, and so on and so forth. Jewish law, though, is very different. Why is that different in Jewish law? Let's see who can find the reason.
Because we're supposed to care. We're supposed
Yeah,
to care.
there's like feeling.
What's different about loans in Jewish law? There's a critical distinction.
The well-being of the individual, the spiritual
No.
well-being. No,
Something else.
something else.
When a Jew lends money, what are they not allowed to do?
Usury.
Good. We're not allowed to charge interest, right?
Mhm.
So if I can't charge interest, why would I ever lend you money? Right? And if you're telling me that I have to lend you money, then it would be very unfair for you to tell me, for God to tell me you have to lend money, and then when the person can't pay back, they can file for bankruptcy. That would be a very unfair method of doing business. So let's see all these sources in the text, and it'll all come together. Lisa, please read for us.
If there will be among you a needy person, you shall not harden your heart, and you shall not close your hand to your needy brother. Rather, you shall surely open your hand to him, and you shall lend him sufficient for his needs while he is lacking.
So it's not this particular source, but this is an elaboration of an earlier source where the Torah says clearly that we have a mitzvah. It's a positive commandment to lend money. So we have a mitzvah to lend money. And at the same time, 7b, please read, Lisa.
Rather, you shall surely open your hand to him, and you shall lend him sufficient for his needs, which he is lacking. When you lend money to my people, to the poor person who is with you, you shall not behave towards him as a lender. You shall not impose interest upon him.
So we have these two very seemingly challenging, I won't say conflicting because they're not really conflicting, but two ideas that run up against each other that create real challenge to the idea of debt discharge. On the one hand, we have a mitzvah to lend money. And on the other hand, we have a prohibition of charging interest. So we're told, God is saying to us, I want you to lend money to this person, but don't charge interest. So what happens when that person can't pay back? If they could discharge their debt, that puts me at a very uncomfortable position of lending money and being concerned that I never get it back. Does this make sense?
Yes, confusing. I mean, yeah, it seems perplexing.
Right? So therefore, we don't have a structure for debt discharge.
Oh.
But then the question comes back the other way. Okay, so now we understand why it is on the creditor's side, why there is no debt discharge. But what's the debtor supposed to do if they've really fallen on hard times and they can't pay back their debt? What do you say? So there's more Jewish tradition involved in here that answers that question. What does the Torah prescribe for somebody who's going hungry?
To help feed them, right?
Right, so there's tzedakah.
Tzedakah.
So a person who's having a hard time making ends meet is able to live off of the tzedakah money. Again, we're not saying that they should use that as an escape from working, but the problem with debt is that it can bring a person to such a place where they can't even think straight, let alone go to work, right? So here we're saying, look, you still owe the money, but for now, you have food to eat, you have a roof over your house, and then go to work and slowly start getting back on your feet, and you'll start paying back your debt. Now, can the creditor go and collect the money from the tzedakah fund to pay back the loan that's owed to him? So Donna is vehemently shaking her head no. And we are going to go to the Radvaz. The Radvaz was who was the Radvaz? Here he is. Rabbi David ibn Zimra. He was born in Spain. He immigrated to Tzfat upon the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. He was a successful businessman. Eventually, he settled in Cairo. Then he came back to Israel, where he authored some of his classic works, commentators on Maimonides. What I love about this is that this is 500 years old, and the application is very, very. I'm teaching a class now, sweetie. I'll give you a little when I come up, okay? But I can't right now. When I come up, I'll give you. This case is 500 years old, and yet read the story. Read what's going on here. This is a responsa from the Radvaz. Go ahead, Donna.
You asked me about the case of Reuben, a poor individual who receives a weekly stipend from the charity fund. His creditor demands that the custodian of the fund repay the debt from the charity funds allocated for Reuben. Is this permitted? Well, putting it this way, I would say like maybe 10%, like you can make us a payment schedule. But
and you good. And you're saying that the payment schedule could even come from communal funds, maybe.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, let's see.
To continue?
Yeah, reply.
Reply, as a matter of law, once charity has been given to the poor person, there's just a dispute among the great legal authorities as to whether the creditor can seize these funds for the payment of his loan. One opinion is that it's forbidden to do so. The logic is that if the charitable giver had known that the creditor would seize the charitable gift, he would never have given it at all. However, Rabbi Simcha and others ruled that the creditor could take his unpaid loan from charity given to the poor. The debate only pertains to surplus charity. However, with regard to the minimal charity allotted per week for the debtor's sustenance, no one argues that the creditor can take this. For if the poor person has enough to live on without those funds, then why would he be taking from the charity fund? If he does not have enough to live, then how can one imagine that he should die of hunger while his creditor is repaid? Therefore, in our case, everyone agrees that the creditor cannot claim it.
Okay, so very clearly that you cannot take the food out of this person's mouth. That's what they need to live off of, and they're not getting rich off of the community. They're just in a survival mode. One more responsa here. Sandrine, would you read for us?
On one hand, secular law is more generous to the debtor vis-à-vis the relationship to the creditor. The secular law gives the debtor more escape hatches than does Jewish law. Jewish law basically says you have no way of escaping the clutches of the creditor, but that has to be understood in tandem with the fact that the communal responsibility towards the debtor are much greater. Alara says the loss is not going to be suffered by the creditor, but the loss will in effect be shared by society as a whole. It's really the theory of loss spreading, like insurance. Insurance is often described as a loss spreading mechanism. Instead of one person suffering a catastrophic loss, all of society through premium bears, all of society through premium bear a little bit of that loss. I would describe the halachic debt collection system that way as well, which means if you only look at it in terms of a creditor and a debtor, it looks like we have a fairly hard-headed system. The debtor has no means of escape. But if you look at the total picture in terms of societal obligation, then you can actually see that it's really a very sophisticated loss sharing mechanism.
So what we have here that although the way I understand this is that although the lender seems to be losing out in this instance, the flip side is it allows for the debtor to begin to get back on their feet, and at the same time, the debt remains owed to the lender. He's not exempted from the debt. And were we to charge the community, so there is a sharing of loss. And I think that's the point here. Then this responds. There's a sharing of loss because we don't have a debt discharge. So therefore, the community has to step up to help this person back on their feet. But the community does not have to pay back the debt. But by helping the person back on their feet, they're empowering that person to make good on their debt eventually. Right? Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So now we have another question. And here's what we're going to do from now for the next 20 minutes. We're going to spend about 10 minutes trying to understand the way we apply this in Jewish law vis-a-vis secular law, and how do we merge these two? How do we coexist with them? And then what would be the halachic conclusion to Rabbi Metzger's scenario before? And we're going to present a few options there. So the first thing is, so we know that Jewish law is not in support of bankruptcy. But what happens when you live in a place where the laws do support bankruptcy? And we have a premise. Our forefather Abraham said that when he came to buy the land from Ephron to bury Sarah, he said, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am both a stranger and a resident. And the commentators he says like this to them: if you want, I'll be like a stranger, meaning I will follow your laws. But if you're not going to be accommodating me, I'm sorry, if you treat me like a resident, then I'll follow your laws. But if you don't treat me like a resident and I'm going to be a foreigner, so then I'm going to do what my God says. And since this land belongs to me, because God promised it, I will take it without paying. In other words, I'm prepared to pay for it, but as long as you're a mensch. If you're not going to be a mensch, I'll take it by force. Right? That was the exchange. And ultimately, Abraham did pay for it, and so on. But in this verse, a stranger and a resident, we actually learned from here some very powerful lessons for how a Jew needs to live in the diaspora. And it's an interesting question, I think a timely question, because both in terms of what's going on in the world right now and what we've seen in the last couple of years, has been a lot of anti-Semitic events, and it brings to mind a reminder that a Jew, we should never get very comfortable, because we never know when we will be challenged again. We maintain our faith in God and our trust in God. And I also find it a little comical that, and I hope I don't offend anybody's political sensitivities, that you have people on one side of the aisle that think that their politicians are the big saviors of protecting the Jews from anti-Semitism, and the people on the other side of the aisle believe the exact same thing about their politicians, which means that there's nothing that's black and white about what's good for the Jews. And therefore, Abraham's words ring very true today as they did 3,800 years ago, that on the one hand, we are residents here, but on the other hand, we are strangers. So the instruction is, how do we live in a country when we live in this tension? So here we go. I'm going to read this one because it's easy. So the Talmud says, Dina de machus dina. The law of the government is the law, which means a Jew needs to follow the laws of the country that they live in. Now, this next passage here is very important. Here we have a disagreement between two of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, and and how they deal with this, the application of that statement of the Talmud. So, Lisa, would you please present both of these opinions and see how, and then we'll discuss how these apply to our scenario.
Okay. Text A, we only apply dina democrata, dina, when the law benefits the king or when it is for the welfare of the people of the land. Otherwise, we do not rule in accordance with non-Jewish laws, as that would render Jewish law null and void.
So let's think about what that means. When it's for the welfare of the people of the land, then we follow it. If it doesn't benefit the people of the land, then we do not rule in accordance with non-Jewish law, as that would render Jewish law null and void. Okay.
Rabbi, I was talking to my brother this morning. I listened to one of Rabbi Solish's, when I was walking this morning, one of his daily power parshas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he said something like, it was really relevant. He said when Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt, right? He was, wealthy and full of wealth. And we went from that to Moses, where, from the era of Moses, where they were slaves in Egypt. It was, completely the rule of whoever the ruler changed. And so the Jews' life completely changed.
Yeah.
According to the whim of the ruler, the king or whatever, the Pharaoh, but it went from, Joseph to Moses.
Yeah, nice. I like that.
Yeah.
So that is very powerful. So here we see, according to Rab Moshe Isserlis, who's known as the Ramah, according to Rab Moshe Isserlis, we do follow the laws of the land unless it rules not in accordance with Jewish law. Okay, let's see what the other opinion says. And this rabbi is Rabbi Shabtai Cohen, otherwise known as the Shach. Go ahead, read.
Text B, even as according to those who maintain that we always say dina demakuta dina, this is only true if the matter does not contradict a law of the Torah. That is, it is a matter not explicitly addressed in Jewish law. Jewish people should never judge according to non-Jewish law when they go against our Torah.
Okay, so what would you say? Would you say, when it comes to the matter of bankruptcy, would you say that both of these rabbis are in agreement, disagreement, or do we split the baby here about how they would apply the rules of bankruptcy?
I think I'm confused. What exactly is dina? I don't have that.
Dina, okay, sure. Let me elaborate. So dina de machus dina means, that's what we read over here in the Talmud. The law of the government is the law. That means that when a Jew is in a country, when in Rome, do as the Romans. When a Jew is in the United States, we have an obligation to follow U.S. law. We touched upon this briefly in our last class, but here we're digging into it a little bit. So the question is, how far does that instruction of the Talmud go? So according to the first commentator, the Ramah, he seems to give a broad description. When the law of the land benefits the king or for the welfare of the people, then we follow the law. Otherwise, we rule in accordance with Jewish law. The second opinion seems to indicate that we follow the law of the land even if it might render a law of a Jewish law null and void, as long as it doesn't contradict Jewish law. So the question is, bankruptcy. Let's apply this to bankruptcy. Okay, does bankruptcy law benefit the king or the welfare of the people of the land, as we've been discussing?
No.
Oh,
it benefits those that can use the law. Yeah, that declare
right.
bankruptcy.
And as we said, it allows for commerce. Right.
Yeah.
That's the logic behind the establishment of bankruptcy laws.
Yes.
So even though Jewish law says that even though Jewish law does not have an instrument of debt discharge in this manner, but since, according to the first text A, according to that opinion, because the law is to the benefit of the people of the land, and even though it's not necessarily in agreement with Jewish law, we would still follow. I'm sorry, we would only follow it. I'm sorry, hold on a second. Now I'm confusing myself. Okay, good. Yeah, so according to text A, bankruptcy would apply. We would follow the laws of bankruptcy since it benefits the people, even though Jewish law does not rule in that same way, because it benefits the people of the land, and you're not in violation of Jewish law when you declare bankruptcy on the land. So it's all good to go. According to the second text, in declaring bankruptcy, the establishment of bankruptcy as an instrument contradicts Jewish law. So since it contradicts Jewish law, we don't follow it. We don't follow the law that contradicts Jewish law. No different than if secular law says you have to work on Shabbos, that's a direct contradiction to Jewish law, and therefore you violate the secular law and you work on Shabbos. I'm sorry, and you keep Shabbos, right? That's a religious matter. But even when it comes to a legal matter, if the secular law, if the law of the land directly contradicts a law of Jewish law, we don't follow the law of the land. That's the instruction of Rabbi Shabtai Meir ben Meir HaKohen. So we
Rabbi,
see.
what about the blue laws? I mean, I grew up in South Carolina. Very much the blue laws were very much in effect. You were not allowed to open on Sunday. So Jewish merchants had to close on Saturday and Sunday.
Good. So that's a great example, actually. When being closed on Sunday, is that a violation of Jewish law in any way? Is there anywhere in Jewish law that says you have to work on Sunday?
No.
So that would be something that both opinions would agree that you should follow the law of the land.
But you can't, you would lose your business, your whole weekend business by that. You would lose Saturday and Sunday business.
Okay, so that's a separate issue, and that is if the fact that we have to be closed on Shabbos is by Torah law. The secular law doesn't say that we have to be closed or that we have to be open, right? So that's a separate issue. The question is about the Sunday law, that we have to be closed on Sunday. The fact that the Torah says that you should follow the law of the land, and there's nowhere in the Torah that says that you have to be open on Sunday. So therefore, according to both opinions, you would have to follow the law. The fact that you might not be able to make a living if you were if you were closed on both Saturday and Sunday is immaterial to this discussion. You got to move. or find a different job, or God should bless you with income in 5 days. And look, and it's a question for a lot of people who keep Shabbos, that they have to make peace with the fact that they're not going to. And by the way, not every business makes money on Sunday, right? There's certain businesses that are Monday through Friday, law firms and accounting firms and so on. But let's continue over here. But that's
a lot of merchants went into wholesale business because
right. That way they're able to do it.
That's what happened, right? Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to how Rabbi Metzger. I'm going to skip through this. Let's go to how the rabbi resolved the matter here. Actually, okay. So before that, let's talk a few other things here, and that is. There's a reference here to the idea of custom, the custom of the land, and the custom of merchants, that merchants agree to certain principles. We spoke about this in the last class, that any condition when it comes to matters of commerce are kept. So if two people agree to something, whether we would apply it in this scenario or not. But there are other considerations. One is the idea of justice. As the verse says, justice shall you pursue. And that is that there are times where we have to compromise a settlement. So here's what the rabbi concluded. The rabbi concluded as follows, that in the case of an insolvent debtor who settled with his creditors by repaying a certain percentage of the debt, and who afterwards was restored to his fortune, the latter-day legal decisors are locked in disagreement as to whether or not he is obligated to repay the outstanding debt. Therefore, all must be done to reach a compromise between the debtor and the creditors in order to satisfy all legal opinions. So his point is that we don't have an answer. It's hard we are undecided as to whether we follow the law of the land and he's off the hook, or whether the Torah's law remains in place here, and the debt is still owed. So therefore, we take a what's called an extra legal moral perspective, and the extra legal moral perspective is to try to bring the two parties to some kind of compromise, because that way there is some measure of win-win, and perhaps some measure of lose-lose, but at least people get something out of it. And then inherently, a person needs to realize that when you borrow money, even if sometimes the law lets a person off the hook, that we have a responsibility to pay back. As we know, I'm not going to read this right now, it's too long, but Mark Twain himself writes of a story where he ended up with a large amount of debt because of some partners that he had taken on, and the business failed. And even though it was his name, the loans were given on account of his good name. And so he spent 4 years traveling the world, engaged in speaking engagements in order to pay off the debt, even though he was, number one, it wasn't his full responsibility, but because of his own good name, he wanted to preserve that. So just a fascinating, you have a person like Mark Twain who took a responsibility at the age of 60 to make sure that he paid off a debt that he had. We also find an interesting thing around the idea of medical malpractice, and that is that Jewish law does not require a doctor who harmed a patient unintentionally to carry legal obligation. Nonetheless, it says that he has a moral obligation to pay the victim. So we see again the idea of going above and beyond. And as we've discussed over this class tonight, that there are certain very clear benefits to paying back the debt. It's good for society because lenders will continue to lend. It's good for you to keep your word. And it's good for you to, from an ethical position, never to take advantage of other people and their willingness to help us out. Bottom line is that we don't have any clear conclusion that Jewish law has a framework for bankruptcy. And so we maintain our obligation unless we find ourselves in a situation where that is in conflict, at which point we try to resolve that by compromise or finding some other way to make good on the debt. So I hope that was we rushed it a little bit at the end, but I want to make sure you guys are able to get to your class. And any questions, please email, text, and you're welcome to ask me a question now also if you like.
I just want to say one quick thing.
Yeah.
We actually had this actually applied in one of our earlier Daily Power Parsha classes, right? Kind of when the pandemic was starting and the unemployment payments were just coming in for some people. So a question was in the group, if I'm getting unemployment, do I still need to give tzedakah on that unemployment? And Rabbi Salish said, preferably if it's not too much of a burden.
Good. Fascinating. Yeah. Very good. Beautiful. Have a good class. And thank you for joining tonight. And we'll see you guys next week, back at the 8 o'clock
Thank
time.
you.
Yes.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Good
You're
night.
welcome. Have a good night.